Thank you.
We're good to go. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Angela. So I think we left off here in terms of depression and in terms of looking at some of the criteria for clinical depression. But the one that I want to emphasize is that if we're aware of any change in the behavior of an older person, that should be a red flag for us. Any change in behavior. So, for example, it could be if somebody always desired to go to church every Sunday or to whatever service they went to, and that was something that they planned, they did, it was very important to them, and then all of a sudden they say to you, I don't go to church anymore, when you ask them about that. That would be a major change in a behavior, and you'd want to explore that with them, talk about that with them. So any change in behavior that might have to do with eating habits or sleep habits. There's so much information now in the literature about sleep issues. One of the things is that working people, for example, nationwide do not get enough sleep. And I just want to ask you by a show of hands, how many of you know for sure, in general, you get enough sleep, at least 8 hours if that's what you need? Raise your hand. How many? Now we're very proud of you, but I had my hand up, but not because I get enough sleep. So sleep, one of the mythologies of older age is that older people don't need to have enough sleep, or they don't need 8 hours or whatever, 7.5 hours. And I often hear this from adult children. I often hear this from older people themselves, is that, oh, I don't need that sleep. And yet what we see with a lot of older people, that they can sleep like gangbusters in the afternoon when there are people around. There is an implication there that maybe something about sleeping at night is a little disconcerting. One of the things that I say to myself every morning when I wake up is that I keep my eyes closed for a little bit, because even as I did this morning, and I say to myself, Patrick, when you open your eyes, you might be in heaven or you might be in the Best Western. And guess what? I was in the Best Western. Because I think about that. Mae Sarton says in her film, she reads the obituaries to see who died, not I. And I think it's very natural as we age that we think about these things. But the other thing I say to myself every morning, I've been doing this for decades, is that I think about my intention for the day. And I urge my older clients too to really ponder this in terms of purpose, or in terms of giving myself some direction. Is what is my intention? How am I going to move into this particular day? And I always say to myself, here's another opportunity for me to be kind. I really have felt for decades that there's not enough kindness in the world. And so I really encourage myself to remind myself that my intention is to be kind. And so I urge you to think about that too, as a simple way to get at, I think, a very complex issue that has to do with purpose. And to, as we're asking older people about their purpose, I think it's really, really helpful if we have one. And because I do a lot of teaching in different universities, what I see often with my master's level students and my undergraduates is that when I ask them what their purpose is, they're often very confused by that question. So I think it's really incumbent on us to think about my purpose. What is my intention for the day? And I think that can be, when it's experienced internal, I think it gives us a way to feel more confident when we're talking to older people. So we want to be aware of, fatigue, loss of interest in activities that used to bring us pleasure, feelings of indecisiveness, worthiness. Do I feel worthy? Thoughts of death or suicidal ideation. All of these I think we need to be familiar with so that we can really think about, this person seems to be exhibiting symptoms of depression, which would be different than disappointment or demoralization. Again, I think we have to be a bit more strategic when it comes to depression. Dr. Clark has looked at depression and suicide, and he said for approximately 60% of all cases of suicide and 83% of elderly suicides, major depression plays a pivotal role in facilitating suicide. And so it really is very important for us to be able to discern the symptoms of depression. And again, one of them is recurrent thoughts of death and or suicidal ideation. And so we want to be aware that, oh yeah, this is important, and to pursue that, to talk about it. The volunteers and staff often say to me, well, how do I even get into this? And I said, I think it starts with hello. It just starts with the beginning, which is, I'm here, my name is Patrick, I'm glad to meet you, however that goes. And with older people, as I said, they are more likely to engage in a conversation than if you come in with all your technical tools in the ready. I think it better for you to come in as a person, and to just meet that other person where they are. The phrase that I say to my staff and volunteers and students is, when somebody says, well, you ask them about how they're feeling today or what they're doing, what are they thinking about? And if they say things like, well, this is difficult and having a hard time, I don't want to go on, blah, blah, blah. What I say to my people is to just say, well, tell me more about that. I'd like to know more. One gentleman said, it's just hopeless. Life is just so bleak. And I said, well, I'd like to know more about that. And he said, well, there's not much to say. And I said, I bet you've been thinking about this for a very long time. And I really want to know about those thoughts that have led you to this point where you say everything is bleak. I'm really curious. I think the thing that I found the most effective in terms of my work with aging is to remain curious, to be interested, to be able to say, I want to know more about that. And once in a while people will say, well, it'll take a long time to understand, for me to tell you that. And I said, and that's great. I've got a lot of time. We'll talk again next week or whatever it is. But let's keep the conversation going rather than a confrontation. Let's keep it open-ended. And again, I really listen to people when they say, nobody listens to me. Do we get so caught up in assessment that we forget the human part of it? I think they both have to be present, and that can be very helpful. So, depression is prevalent, we know, in older people, and it's very challenging to diagnose. There's a reason why depression goes unrecognized and untreated, because I think it's difficult to have that conversation. It substantially, again, increases the risk for functional decline and suicide. The prevalence of depression, again, is expected to increase. And one of the things in some of the literature, some researchers say that depression can precipitate drinking, particularly among women. And one of the things about exploring the use of alcohol or other substances, it's very hard to have those discussions. And I just ask people, do you use alcoholic beverages? And can we talk about that? Sometimes they'll say no, as I said earlier. Okay, but I'll come back to it. Again, late life depression manifests, again, misdiagnosed, undertreated. And then late life depression aggravates existing medical conditions. But see, I think the thing, again, is that older people themselves don't realize if they are depressed. They don't know. They don't have a vocabulary for it. And even when they say some of these symptoms, they don't know that they're describing a depressed state because of that stigma. And I think we have to be very thoughtful about that and to help them develop a way of talking about an internal experience. My working in the field of aging, particularly with people who are in their 80s or 90s, is that it's really important that we have an internal life. I was walking into a hospice one day where I had a client, and she had a roommate, but she wasn't there when I got there, and they had reminded me that she had an appointment or something at a hospital. And but there was a gentleman there that I hadn't seen before, and I just said hello to him, and he reached out for my hand, and he grabbed my hand, and he said to me, "Am I dying?" Oh. And I thought, what am I going to say to him? And I said, well, I was kind of taken aback at first. And I said, well, you know, you're in hospice. And I said, you probably know that in order to be here, you probably have a 6-month or some prognosis about a bad illness. And he said, yeah, I have cancer. And he said, but am I dying? And I said, well, have anybody talked to you about that? And he said, I want to know from you, am I dying? Oh, okay. And I said, well, here's what I'm going to say. I would suspect that you are, and I don't know what this means in terms of time, but I said, do you have family? Yes, I have family. Have they come to see you? No. And I said, well, are you married? And he said, yes, but he said, you know, my wife and I haven't talked to each other in years, although we still live together, but she'll never come. And I said, well, do you have adult children? Yeah, I have 2 or I think 3 children, he said, but they don't come either. He said, what I was the money machine. I worked, and I put them through college, and I took care of the house, and I did all these things, but they're not here now. And I said, well, let me ask you a question then. Do you think you're dying? And he said, this can't be it. This can't be the end. And you know, and he started to cry, and I was so touched by this guy, because I just bet that never in his life did he acknowledge that the time of death was approaching. And then he said he just kept busy all his life. And I think these are the things that are so deeply human and deeply personal. And that, you know, I just took off all my professional garb, and I just sat there with him as he took that in, you know, and you know, and I guess that somebody had told him about his I don't think that he didn't know that, but I think he didn't feel it, you know, and I think there's a big difference between thinking something and then feeling it. And my hunch was that this guy probably didn't feel a whole lot in his life, but he accomplished a lot and made a lot of money. And I forget who I was talking to during the break about, you know, when value is the economics, it fails us in the end. You know, William Paley, who was the founder of CBS, was alleged to have said at his deathbed, and with all my money too? You know, isn't that like amazing? I really believe when people say to me that most people live unconsciously. I agree, you know? But at these times, I just think it's really tough when you're in hospice and you wake up to the fact that I am indeed going to die sometime soon. He died 2 weeks later, and the family never did come to see him. And he got me just because I couldn't not go. And I was a poor substitute for his family, but it was so deep, you know, that emotional feeling that he had, and I was really grateful that I was there. And I think that that's where we need the human touch, you know, and people just need to talk, you know, talk about what this is like. I mentioned to a couple other people I was talking to, Irvin Yalom. Are you familiar with his book, Staring at the Sun, Overcoming the Terror of Death? I urge you to read that. Irvin Yalom, Y-A-L-O-M, Overcoming the Terror of Death. And Irvin Yalom is very well known. You know, and in his book he talks about how people just, you know, we're the only creature on the planet that knows deep in our DNA that we are going to have a time limit on this planet. And yet most people don't live that way. And it's often a shock. And he said it's particularly true around round birthdays, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80. And that, you know, when people have this awareness, I was taking care of one of my son's friends. She was turning 30, and I was babysitting for her. And I got over there, and her husband and all the friends had gone to the restaurant, and she was the last one to go. And I said, oh, happy birthday, Melissa. And she burst into tears, and she is hugging me and saying, oh my God, I'm so old, I'm so old. And I said, Melissa, would you just open your eyes and look at who you're talking to? You know, and I knew, you know, Irvin Yalom says that at 30 is sometimes the first time that a young person has this window open that says life is about impermanence. And so I said to her, you know, I said, I know you're feeling something. And she said, oh, and what if I die and my kids and and I'm just starting to live. And I said, and for most people, you're going to live a long life. But I said, I think we need to chat about this. You know, and I know you've got to go off to your party, but I said, you know, let's just kind of check in around it. And she said, well, I don't think I should talk about this at the party. And I said, well, if I was at the party, let's talk about that. That really intrigues me. But I said, well, probably not. But then since then, and that was a number of years ago, and since then, you know, everyone, and I can see that when I'll say to her, do you want to talk? And she knows what I mean. And then, well, if we're at a barbecue or something, we'll sit and chat about this. And I said to her, I said, do you talk about this with your husband? Oh, no, he would just get upset. You know, and, but I'm so glad that I'm able to have that conversation with her. And so I would look at people in your life that are willing to say, if you want to have a conversation about real life, not about the fake life, but the real life, I hope you can do that. I think that means a great deal to people. So, go ahead. Irvin Yalom, Y-A-L-O-M. Irvin is his first name, I-R-V-I-N. So I want to go to this slide, and there's other slides in there, but one of the things that, yes?
What was the LD?
Okay. Did you? Late life depression. So what we also have to look at is assessment of values. And as I was saying during the break, I think we have to really, all of us need to look at our values and see, is it time for a change? As I said probably earlier, when money becomes the value and meaning in our lives, there is no meaning. Yeah, it's good to have enough money, that sort of thing, but you know, accumulating dollars isn't going to help us in the end, as William Paley allegedly had to face. So we need to cultivate other things, but we need also, and this is so crucial, I say this to my clients all the time, that we upgrade our phones. You know, what? Every time you turn around, you need a new, what are we now on with iPhone 6 something or other, S? If you have an iPhone 4, you're so yesterday. And you know, so we upgrade TV, we upgrade all these things, our cars and whatever. But do we ever update our values? You know, and I certainly believe that people need to do that. And when we look at values, they're ideals that matter most to people in their life. They determine one's actions before one's actions can be subjected to critical thought. That's why I think it's so crucial that we have conversations with people who are thinking about death or are ideating suicide. It's like, what is the value that's promoting this? And it's often independence, autonomy, or it has to do with dignity or responsibility. And these researchers have said that they see that when you look carefully at what causes people to think about suicide, it's often a threat to their autonomy, a threat to their independence, a threat to their dignity. And we need to have those conversations. We need to talk about it. And what I say to people is, I think it's time for an upgrade. Because if you're still valuing things you valued at 5 years old, I think that is not correct when you're 80, to be still holding the values that a 5-year-old had. I do not want a 5-year-old running my mind, you know, and I was fine at 5, but that was a long time ago. I want to upgrade. I want to think about what is really important to me now, and how do I talk about it? And that's where the tell me more phrase comes into it. When people say to me something about loss of their independence, I said, tell me more. What does that mean? You know, I have to pull myself up. You know, see, I don't think that we communicate in a meaningful way with each other. Many times I'm interviewing people, older people, for groups that I facilitate, and I'll say to them, when was the last time you had a meaningful conversation? A meaningful conversation. And it's astounding what they say. One woman said she hasn't had a meaningful conversation since her husband died 20 years ago. That was her last meaningful conversation, and she lives in a senior residence. And I said, well, what do you talk about? She said, well, here, Patrick, what we talk about a lot is food. And it's always critical. You know, rarely do we say, we like the chicken we were served last night. And she said, the other thing we talk about a lot is the weather. And what we avoid is everything else. And I've heard this repeated so many, many, many times. And I think that is shocking. And it's not a surprise to me then when people who are bumping up to some of these critical issues about being human on this planet, death, dying, contemplating whether I kill myself or not. These are big topics. But if I don't have practice at littler ones, except the food or the weather or the kids or whatever, I don't have much background in terms of talking about it. So I can't think of upgrading my value system because I don't even know how to talk about the one I have. And so instead of independence, I think we need to think about intradependence. Autonomy, I think we need to think about community. We need to look at how other cultures provide support or care for their loved ones. Yes?
I have a question. One of the things that we can talk about that people get disconnected from society, this is like that engagement. What do you think about technology? People are able, they think they're connected, but yet they kind of alone, and they don't have a million friends on Facebook, but really, is that an illusion, or how do you see where that trend shifted? I mean, this seems like technology set is. As that replace really that human side of us,
right.
Being able to touch this and being able, because you see now the new generation that they're not even able to pass an interview because they don't have the skills. Or
right.
Some employers, I say that, I'm not saying that, but they
no.
So I guess my question is just from your perspective, I would like to hear you. What do you think about that?
Well, you probably have a little bit of a sense of what I'm going to say about technology and communication. I think technology, I mean, I'm certainly not saying I don't support technology. I think the sharing of information is really important. I think I'm always very grateful when I'm preparing my lectures or my curriculum that I'm glad I have the internet capacity and things like that. Texting, emailing, voicemail, that sort of thing. I teach a class on communication skills, and one of the things I talk about is how technology is getting in the way of this. We're forgetting the energy of what it feels like to be among people, the visual, There is a lot happening in terms of energy among us that you don't get. And I don't think there's an emoticon in this world that's going to convey the energy that is being experienced here, or just being able to look at somebody. So much of that is missed. And I agree with you. People will say to me, I had a student one day, we're talking about this, and she said she had something like 1,500 friends on Facebook. And I said, oh my God, you should be running for office. I mean, you shouldn't be sitting here. I just find that, but it's like the word friend, the substance, the soul of that word has been sucked out. That's not what they're saying. They say the word friend, add a friend, whatever that is. My son and daughter-in-law put me on Facebook, and I'm like, why? And just like, it's so fatiguing to just, and then people are saying they're at Kmart or they're at Safeway. What do I care? You know, I'm not interested. And then they have a map and they show you where you are. I'm like, what? Who cares? But what experts in communication are starting to address, because now enough time has passed, that there are grave concerns about exactly what you're talking about. And it has to do with intimacy, has to do with loneliness, has to do with being able to communicate important things, difficult things to another person. And one of the researchers that I've read had said the problem that we're going to see, because you see this with 2-year-olds, it breaks my heart when that 2-year-old is sitting on a screen, and we're all sitting there, and the 2-year-old is on some little baby pad, I don't know what they are, but he or she's like really active, and I'm thinking, oh my God, this kid should be playing, you know. And researchers are saying because of the just the enormous number of folks who are giving these things to their kids, that they're not going to know how to have an internal process, you know, how to be by themselves, because they're always tuned in. And we know a lot of parents, I'm not really against technology, even though it might sound like it. I think it can be useful, but not as a babysitter, you know. Not having these high school kids on the internet till 5 in the morning and then like dragging themselves into school. But researchers are very concerned that we're going to create a population of people who are not going to know how to experience aloneness, that they're not going to have creativity and imagination unless they have a screen in front of them. So that kind of imaginative play that children, and I imagine most of us in this room, had to figure out as a kid. I grew up in the country. I didn't have, other than my brothers who were not always friendly, I had to kind of make do for myself. And I'm grateful I had that background. And I say to my dying day, horses were my friend growing up. Because they understood what was going on with me, where people were not as convenient for that. But I have grave concerns about technology. Not that it's not important, but I think it's how we're using it. So I think we need to really ponder that. And I say to my students in communication skills, we do an exercise where they have to leave the building and just sit out in the quad or take a walk around the grounds. And I say to them, but you have to leave your cell phones. Oh my God, you'd think I said you have to cut off your right leg or something. Oh my God, one woman said, I cannot do that. And I said, well, if you want to get a good grade in this class, you're going to have to let that there. And I said, I'll watch it, I'll protect those, I won't let anybody steal them. And it was so hard for some people. And these are people, not 18 to 22-year-olds, these are older. And many of them, when I have them come back, and all they have to do is 20 minutes of sitting outside in nature. And they'll come back and they'll say, I was worried about texts that I got and that I didn't respond to. There is now a body of literature that's talking about why, and those of you that teach know this, is that, you know, I'm kind of giving up in terms of having them put the things away. Because I've been reading these articles about how people are addicted to their texts. They must respond. If they don't, they're going to be agitated. They're not going to be paying attention anyway. And so I say to them, just really please listen. And I know you have to respond to that text, but can you just put it off just to examine how you're feeling, particularly in counseling skills? Come on. We need to do that. But there is a lot of concern about that I have. So I think that's a good question, but I don't have a really good answer. I just want to move on here for a moment to Thomas Joyner before we make the switch. You know, Thomas Joyner, his father died by suicide. And is anybody familiar with Thomas Joyner? No, nobody? He has an interpersonal theory of suicide. And you can see where, because of his own father's suicide death, that he was really spending a lot of his career trying to come up with a framework. And so to back up everything we've been talking about, here is a framework that you can hold on to that the American Association of Suicidology strongly values. And I see the importance. It gives us a way to think through these issues. And not surprisingly, serious suicidal behavior requires the desire for death. And so, the person is thinking about death. Thus, in terms of a symptom of clinical depression, is recurrent thoughts of death and or suicide. And that's the question that I think is so relevant that we talk about with people is, are you thinking about death? Okay, if the answer is yes, are you thinking about death by suicide? Are you thinking that as, okay, yes. And then right there I say, and I would like you to tell me more about this. How long have you been thinking about this? And what are you thinking about it? And the desire for death is composed of two psychological states. Again, I'm sure many of you know this, but I'm asking you to take it in deeper because you hear this all the time from older people. One is perceived burdensomeness. I'm a burden to my family. You heard that with the gentleman's suicide note I read, that he had been a failure at practically everything. He was a failure to his family. He perceived himself to be a burden to a family that had no idea that he wanted to kill himself. They did not see that, And so, as his wife said to me, she said, if he held this back from me, and it's so important, how many other things did he hold back from me? I'm questioning my whole marriage. And I think that is, again, when I say the survivors are carrying a lot of burden themselves, a lot of weight that they need to talk about. The second part of the psychological state of death is failed belongingness. I don't belong anymore. You won't see me at Christmas time. I can't go to the barbecue. I have this walker, or I have to walk with a cane. It's going to be rough terrain. I can't do it. That I just don't belong there anymore. And I know you hear this, but what I'm encouraging us is to put them together as that this person is thinking about death, but they're not saying that to you. They're not saying I'm thinking about death. They're saying, I feel like a burden to my family. I feel like I just don't belong anymore. And I understand that. Those of you that have the color hair that I do, it was one thing to talk about ageism when it was happening to other people. It's another thing when it's directed at me. When I was in Berkeley and I was crossing across this quad in order to go to the talk, and the talk by it was just such a surprise, afterwards, that when I thought about this, is that I was going to hear Thich Nhat Hanh talk. And he was a Vietnamese monk that was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize back in the 60s. And I'm walking across there and I hear somebody yell out of a window, "Hey, oldie, you're moving pretty fast." And I'm looking around for the oldie. And that's typical, right? It's not me. And then finally I realized nobody's around. And this voice said, "I mean you, oldie, you." And I turned around, I looked up, and there was a young woman. And this was a high school, Berkeley High School. And she said, "Yeah, you better watch it. You're going to fall and hurt yourself." And I thought, okay, just keep walking, Patrick. And I turned around and I said, because even then I woke up saying, I got to be kind. And I said, "Thank you for your consideration." And I walked on. And then I got into Thich Nhat Hanh. And, just if you've ever seen him, oh my God, and the monastics, and they're all chanting, and all this energy just came out of me in terms of tears, and I'm just crying, and it's great there because nobody cares. I love that. I think tears are very important. I don't want anybody to stop me when I cry, just like let it go. And there it was great because they could have cared less, because those monastics are so mesmerizing. And I thought, Patrick, you're going to have to get used to this because you live in an ageist society. You got to be prepared for this. This is going to come up. And I'm glad you were kind, and just keep on going. But it's difficult. So when these psychological states occur, the desire for death is produced. I don't belong, failed burden, I'm a burden. And you combine this then, and this is the thing that he says, this is what we have to really think about, is the acquired capacity or ability for self-injury, that I can do this. I can do this. When we look at, we'll be talking about military veterans, and what we see in terms of literature, it's like 22 returning vets a day die by suicide, and that's not with all states reporting. And that's so alarming. But do we do anything? No. If we said that was 15 to 24-year-olds, we would be out there right now raising money, doing all kinds of interventions and planning, ways to connect with young people. But we just don't. But people that come back from war, people that have engaged in some kind of violent behaviors, will think about the capacity. They know that they could do this. Law enforcement personnel have a high suicide risk. Hunters have a high suicide risk. So we know that a serious suicide attempt could follow when you combine this state of death with the acquired ability for self-harm. So he goes on to talk about that acquired capability, and it's if you've been a multiple attempter. That's why I said earlier, is you want to ask that older person, how was it when you were young? Or I know you were divorced at 30 and you had to raise 3 kids on your own. How was that? Did you ever think about suicide? You want to gather that kind of data. A non-multiple attempter with 3 out of the following 5 symptoms: a single suicide attempt, an aborted suicide attempt, self-injecting drug use, self-harm. We're thinking of cutters. I've seen older people that just cannot find psychological words, emotional words for what's going on, but they cut themselves, and they're 80. It's like, we need to really make sure that the person has some kind of vocabulary to talk about how I feel. How do I feel? I stopped asking older men how they felt, because that was like walking into a dark rabbit hole. And so I say to them, what are you thinking about? And then we at least can begin a conversation. Then I'll work emotions into it later, because as I said, the gentleman who said to his best friend, I love you, the friend would not respond and reciprocate to that. So he's like, hey, love, I don't know. But I texted him when I was here, and I said, just a reminder, I love you. And he texted back and he said, I love you too. And I said, okay, this is good. Frequent exposure to physical violence, trauma, as I said earlier in the morning. You've got to explore that with people, because if they felt they were going to die, and I know there are people in this room who were probably harmed as children, but you didn't think that everything was going to be rosy. You might have thought, as your dad was strangling you, that you were going to die. You didn't know he was going to let go. The fact that you thought you were going to die is crucial to his theory. So we want to be aware of that. And then, of course, here's a theoretical framework that you can look at, and how social disconnectedness leads to social isolation or functional impairment, or one to the other. The acquired capability, access to lethal means, physical illness and pain. I think that is a good kind of interpretation of something, again, that is quite complex. So I wanted to, and then we see with suicide in men, again, men are overrepresented in the suicide statistics, and one has to ask yourself, what is that due to? Well, risk factors include depression, early dementia. I've known a number of men who believed they didn't even have a neuropsych exam, that they were forgetting to the point where they thought indeed they had dementia, and they killed themselves. And they might not have had that. Severe and chronic medical conditions, alcoholism, recent loss, availability of a firearm. And the other thing is the lack of a wealth of information about communication of emotion, feelings. There's so many good books about this. The book that I find really helpful is Bell Hooks. I don't know if you've heard of her. Hooks is her last name. And it's called The Will to Change. The Will to Change by Bell Hooks. And she really talks, she's an African-American sociologist, And she writes so eloquently about the problems with men. Robert Bly had said in his book, Iron John, that one shaming experience for a little boy can last that little boy a lifetime. And we don't give men a whole range of feelings that they can choose from. Generally, it's one, and that's anger. You know, I've had grievers in there, and this one griever man had said to me, or said to the group, he said, we were talking about different feelings that come up, and he said, Patrick, I have one feeling for everything. When I'm sad, I get angry. When I'm upset, I get angry. Anger is the one emotion that I have. So we need to think about that. And then you can read the rest of these, but I want to go on to the next group, which has to do with the military. Would you mind, or one of you, change my slide? And this ties into that anyway, so yes.
During that transition, can I ask two questions?
Oh, yeah.
One is, tell me again the May Sarton film.
May Sarton, old age is a foreign country.
And the second question is, I was reading ahead, and you had some information in there about transferring hope. Can you elaborate on that a little bit, since I'm not part of the social community, I'm not trying to know that.
Transitions of hope. What I think that we must do if we're going to interact and engage with people that might be suicidal in a as healthy way as possible is that we have to remain hopeful, and we have to believe, you know. And again, I'm talking about people that are ideating suicide. I'm not talking about people that are wanting to do the right to die and, you know, talk to two physicians and, you know, they have a terminal illness. That's a different group of people. I'm talking about people that are suicidal. And I think it's really important to offer transfusions of hope, even to somebody that feels despair. And over my career, one of the things that I say all the time is that I remain hopeful. I remain hopeful. I know it's hard for you. I know it's very hard for you. But I remain hopeful. And the reason is because we're talking. We're connecting. You know, that we have a relationship. And I always say to people, this relationship is very sacred. You know, it's very important. I take any interaction that I have with people seriously. It's not, you know, relationships are not disposable. I just don't say that's it, you know. Somebody said to me, oh, I'm just another one of your clients, like client number 2002. No, that's not my experience of it. You know, each person is unique, you know, and that makes our work, I think, very exciting, but also challenging, because I don't think, you know, one formula fits everybody, because everybody is very different and everybody's very unique. So it's not just one person that is depressed, it's one person that has symptoms of depression. It's not one person that's demented, it's one person that has symptoms of dementia. I try very hard to be able to say that, because I think it's so important that we see people first, and then we see, you know, what the symptoms are that they have. I've had people that come to me and say, I'm a depressive. And I say, well, let's back up. When you were born, were you a depressive? You know, I think you were a baby. And we didn't talk about that. You were just here on the planet. So I want to see the person first and the mental health issue secondly. So now we're going to kind of move from looking at men, and although women are certainly represented in the military, men still are the number one in terms of just numbers. So, you know, when we talk about the military service and we're talking about older people, we're talking about people that now might be in their 90s, and you know, they might have been through World War II. Some of you have parents who were alive still, maybe. My dad would have been 95 had he lived, and he went to war when he was 19, I think he turned 20, because he went to war in the summer, and his birthday's in September. And my mother said, oh, he used to write diaries. I keep journals myself. He played the violin, never drank, And when he came back from the war, my older brother had been born, because my older brother is 4.5 years older than I am. And he came back and he had this 3-year-old. And the first night back, he beat my mother up and was drunk. And that just continued the rest of his adult life. And there was no such thing as assessment. There was no such thing as we will get help for him. There was no such thing such as the word alcoholism. No one said, what they said is, oh, your dad works so hard and he has to let off steam. What he was probably somebody that was dealing with post-traumatic stress, but no treatment other than alcohol. And that's what they did in World War II, is that they drank. And then the Korean War then was the introduction of other kinds of drugs, and then the Vietnamese War. Is it? Oh, okay. Thank you so much. I feel with my life I need a little group of people just to travel along with me, because things go wrong. I locked my keys in the trunk of this rental car. I couldn't believe it yesterday. In the Dales of all places, it's 900 degrees. And I'm like, hey, yikes. But I got out of the mess, which was what I'll focus on. So these are just various wars that have, and there's other minor wars within these more major wars that people have been involved in. And there are 21.8 million veterans in the U.S., 20.2 are men, and 1.6 million are women. So I don't want to forget that women have been involved in armed conflict and also suffer from stress-related issues. 73.4% of all U.S. veterans have a VA service-connected disability rating. Every 65 minutes, a military veteran commits suicide. And so that's, really important aspect of this talk. The VA only began tracking war veteran suicide since 2008. They never tracked that before. And not all states are reporting, so that number of 22 returning vets per day have died by suicide. We don't even know what the actual numbers are because other states have not participated in that. There's been an average of almost 21,000 service members diagnosed with TBIs every year since 2000. So we don't really have good data on other people, or people like my father or your fathers that were engaged in World War II. They're dying out. So when I do these talks and I'm thinking about my dad, that my dad was probably this very decent person that played the violin and kept diaries until he went to war, and he was in Patton's army for 4.5 years with his, or 4 years, with his twin brother, identical twin brother. And they both were alcoholics and drank the rest of their lives and caused terrible damage to their families. According to the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, out of the 16 million who served our nation in World War II, approximately 855,000 are still alive. Has anybody been to that? You did? And Clara, what did you think of that? Yeah, I've heard really good things.
It's very moving how many very elderly people, men and women, are there.
Yeah.
Really acknowledging that.
Yeah, I think it's so important. I think it's so important that that exists, especially when you see that the numbers have dwindled so much in terms of older people who were participating in that. Somebody else? Yes? Oh.
That was one of the last things my father-in-law did. He was 89, and that was one of the last things he was willing to do.
Oh my gosh. So you and your dad did that together? You went to the museum? Our father-in-law. Oh, well, that wonderful. That was really, how did he feel about it?
Emotional.
Yeah.
But also, he has a son, my brother-in-law, who was a Vietnam vet, and really, they never actually really talked about the experiences. And in his last days, they were able to have a conversation like that together.
So in the last days of his life, he was able to talk with the person, the son, about Vietnam. That is really, yeah, that's so good. I really am glad that you were both there. Thank you. What we now call PTSD was referred to by various names. In the Civil War, it was called soldier's heart. In World War I, it was called shell shock. In World War II and Korean War, it was referred to as combat fatigue. PTSD was first described in the DSM-3 in 1980. And the prototype for environmentally induced disorder triggered by an external event is what PTSD was described at that time, and involved emotional deregulation and memory disturbance. Emotional deregulation and memory disturbance. You know, it's that deregulation that I think is so powerful when it comes to men and suicide. Those of you that took child development, if you remember, I currently teach child development, and I've been doing that for years, and I love the relationship between child development and older age, because I think one of the biggest influences on adult development is family of origin. And one of the things that you probably did when you were a child, if you had fairly healthy parents, is that if you were having a fit at Safeway and you threw yourself on the floor in the produce section, if you had a healthy parent, that healthy parent probably came over and said, I understand. You know, I understand. It's 5 o'clock in the afternoon. You're hungry, you're tired, you had it, and you're letting me know. And so I'm going to kind of hold you so you don't wiggle out and just calm you down. Because I want to teach you how to regulate basic human emotion. To regulate anger. See, the thing is, when we look at so many men are really good at anger, you know, really experts at anger, you know. Rage, hey, graduate school, you know, so really good at it. But what I find with so many men, especially in this age group, is that they don't know how to regulate that anger, how to tone it down, how to talk about it, emotions, as I said. And they're kind of on their own, because what I see, again, as I said earlier, the wife is going to say, oh, don't upset him. The daughter's going to say, oh, he's going to get really mad, and then life as we know it's going to come to a halt. It's like, that's too much power for one emotion. You know, we need to learn how to regulate it. And so when I see that involved in emotional deregulation, you know, now there's not even a prayer because I'm deregulating. I'm just letting it all out. But it's not a healthy letting it all out. The concept essentially is the same, empirically validated and consensus achieved, that we know that people experience this, and it arose after the Vietnam War. And this just kind of goes into that in a little bit more detail. And it's difficult to determine because the diagnostic criteria was not determined until 35 years after the war in terms of World War II vets. So people like my dad or your dad didn't get the treatment that they deserved. You know, they didn't get the help that might have changed the lives of so many people that they touched in a negative way. Many World War II vets received diagnoses of anxiety neurosis, depressive neurosis, melancholia, antisocial personality, sometimes even schizophrenia, but nothing about the trauma of war, you know, and what has happened to people. We see this on the news, you know, these horrible things. The Orlando tragedy, which was just, what, weeks ago. In one of my groups, drop-in group for trauma, there were 2 people there, parents, whose children, adult children, died there in Orlando. And both parents, they didn't know each other, but they said that their adult children were, you know, because Orlando is touristy, and so they were there doing other things, you know, on vacation, and then they just happened to go with a group of people. Those 2 adults didn't know each other, but they were just with another group of people, and they went out to this nightclub, and they never came back because they were shot and killed. And the trauma experienced by these parents is so palpable. You can just feel it. The shock, the disbelief that this one father was saying, I know I'm saying my son was killed in Orlando, but I can't believe at the same time I'm saying my kid was killed in Orlando, that he must be alive. And of course he isn't. Trauma, it seems like there's no sparsity when it comes to trauma. San Bernardino, you know, Sandy Hook, you know, Dallas. I mean, this is getting a bit ridiculous. Symptoms of PTSD surfaced as a result of a retirement. This is what we're seeing. I've seen this in, you're in hospice, and I forget the other person in hospice. Oh, she's back there. That you might see this with some of these older men, is that while they were, after the war, they're involved with, you know, having families or getting jobs. And just as that gentleman in hospice, when he was saying, am I going to die? And what sometimes comes up is the past trauma that has never been talked about, never been felt or experienced. So many times I meet people my age or younger and whose parents were in the war of some kind, and I'll say, were you able to have a conversation about that? And they say, no, that just doesn't ever get talked about. But you know, that just can't, this organism can't hold all that trauma easily. It's got to come out, and oftentimes it comes up as people age. That there's no containment for it anymore, because now they're sick or they're old, and they're aware that they can't put the muzzle on it anymore. So it often comes up. As one ages, a person has too much time on their hands, and so they can't manage through activity, and they have to let that out. And it can be a lot of excessive regret and self-deprecating thoughts. World War II vets lived through the Great Depression and experienced severe deprivation prior going to war. You know, my father was also born and raised on a farm, but it was less well off than the farm I grew up on, and that was pretty bad. So he didn't have a whole lot going into that. Such pre-war experiences had partially inoculated some people from the effects of the combat because they didn't have it so good to begin with. So this was kind of like not such a shock as it was for a lot of men. The stigma of mental health and seeing a mental health professional was very strong. My father, not in his wildest dreams, you know, would have ever accepted to see anybody, even though even his employer had said, you know, if you're going to continue to work here, you've got to see somebody because we know you're drinking alcoholically. And he got fired instead after being there for something like 30 years. And he wrote me one letter in his life, and the letter was, he did go into rehab for about a week, and he wrote, you know, part of that is to write to your family, and he wrote me a letter, and he said, they tell you that you can't get booze in here, and he put, ha ha, I know how to get around that. And he said, and I don't know what the fuss is all about, why you, he called me Pats, why you Pats and your mother think drinking is so bad. I love to drink, and I'm going to continue to drink. That's the way it is. And then he signed his name. They used alcohol to deal with emotional pain, and that was widely accepted. And so there's been a steep rise in PTSD you know, over time. And so in the World War II era, 1941 to 1946, it would be, you know, in terms of what they can get in terms of numbers, was something like maybe 15,000 men suffered from PTSD. Now you know that that was so much more than that. Korean War, this is what they're seeing, Vietnam War, 348,000. Now you see a huge change because VA was much more sensitive to this. Now within the DSM-3, they had something more to work with, some kind of guideline. And then in the Gulf era, 250,000. So you can see how there's been a steep increase in terms of PTSD claims. I know families, even now, who are still struggling to get some information from the VA that their dad or their grandfather, whoever it might be, has suffered with PTSD, and it's not always easy to get that. The U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs estimates that PTSD afflicts almost 31% of Vietnam vets, as many as 10% of the Gulf War, and 11% of the war in Afghanistan. And these are just estimates. So who can have PTSD? Anyone can get PTSD at any age. This includes war veterans, survivors of physical and sexual assault, abuse, accidents, disasters, and many other serious events. not necessarily everyone who are involved in some of these horrendous things, but I worry about the people in Orlando, for example, that were in the club who didn't die, but who were surrounded by people who were dying.